All right, so let's go ahead and get started on this tutorial. But before that, I actually want to go over a couple of things very quickly. I've been getting a lot of feedback from you guys. One of the things you've been saying you would like me to do is to increase the font size of the code. So I unfortunately didn't increase the font size enough, I think, for this video, but I promise next time I will use an even bigger font. Just let me know in the comments if the font is still not big enough. If it isn't big enough, I am actually going to be following your other piece of advice that you've been requesting, and that is to upload the code to GitHub. So I'll include a link in the description so you guys can actually go to GitHub and see the final result there. And if the code is not big enough, please go to your video settings and actually manually set it to 1080p, and you should be able to see it even on mobile phones. But if not, then I do apologize. I'll make sure I get it right the next time. Second thing I wanted to address, I wanted to say thank you to Martin. He is my very first patron, and I went ahead and created a Patreon account. I'm going to include the link in the description. If you are interested in supporting me, or if you are interested in any of what the tiers offer, please go to Patreon and consider looking at that. And let's go ahead and show you guys what this app does. So as you can see here, we have a to-do list app, and I'm going to put some generic stuff like grocery shopping. Go ahead and do that. Take out trash. Add that, and then just like eat food or something. And then so we can add to-dos, and we can click on a to-do and go ahead and delete the to-do when we're done with it. And that is the basic app. Now we're going to be writing plain JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript for this, although we are going to be importing jQuery specifically for Bootstrap, but we're not going to be writing any jQuery code. This is a 100% vanilla JavaScript app. So let's get started. Oh yeah, and sorry, first, there are going to be a couple of prerequisite topics I want to go over. I'm going to provide a timestamp in the description below if you want to skip over the prerequisite topics. It's about 8 minutes long, so I really do recommend you actually go through that and watch the prerequisite topics. It goes over some things that are pretty interesting about JavaScript, especially if you're new or if you've been working in JavaScript pre-ES6. So let's get started. So look in the description if you want to skip all this. Otherwise, let's dig into these prerequisite topics really quick. So we're going to start with arrow functions. So this is an example of a standard arrow function. It does the exact same thing as this normal function here, the type of function that you probably have seen if you were working in JavaScript a while back and then you're kind of getting back into it or something. But this is how we used to define functions in JavaScript. Now we can still do this, but this is the newer way, and it does the exact same thing as this. Okay, so const example function equals, and then we have two parentheses here to kind of represent that this is going to be a function, and then this arrow that in my head I say goes to, and then whatever is in between these two brackets is the function. So I'm gonna say const example function is equal to a function that goes to this functionality. That's how I remembered it when I first learned how to do this. It is the easiest way for me. So if we have parameters or arguments that this function needs, it would go in here. Next thing, this single line arrow function does exactly what these do here. It does the exact same thing. It's just shorthand. It allows us to get rid of the return and these curly braces and write it in one line. So it's smart enough to know that if you say const example function equals a function that goes to im function, it knows that it's going to just be simply returning this string. So this is shorthand. Then if we want to return an object, say example function, all that it's going to do is return an object, then there's shorthand for that too. So this right here is the exact same thing as this down here. We get rid of the return and we get rid of these curly brackets right here, and we just wrap the object inside of parentheses, and it just knows to return that. So that's more shorthand. Here is what it would look like if you pass an argument to an arrow function. But since there's only one argument, you actually don't need these parentheses. So you can actually get rid of the parentheses and do it like that if you'd like. It's up to you. But if you have more than one argument, you actually are going to need the parentheses. So that is arrow functions. Let's move on to truthy and falsy. Or actually, yes, let's move on to truthy and falsy. Actually, I apologize. Let's do the ternary operator first. So the ternary operator, so you know that there's a unary operator in JavaScript, or this is an example of a unary operator in JavaScript, is this exclamation point. It converts a Boolean value. So if I say not, you can say not, true, then this unary value will actually flip this Boolean, and that will actually be equal to false. So that is a unary operator. Then we also have binary operators, which are operators you're more familiar with. Unary is unary because it acts on one operand. Binary acts on two operands. A ternary operator acts on three, and we only have one of those in JavaScript, and it's called the conditional operator. So we can actually call this the conditional operator or the ternary operator, and it means the same thing. So call it whichever one you want. People will understand what you're talking about. So how does this work? So with the ternary operator, like I said, you have three operands. We have something that is going to evaluate to either true or false, or truthy or falsy, which we'll get to shortly. Then we have an expression on the left side of a colon and an expression on the right side of a colon. Okay? So if this evaluates to falsy, which in this case it does, it evaluates to literally false. 1 is not greater than 2. That is false. So since that's false, it's actually going to return what's on the right side of the colon. However, if it's true, like it is down here, it will return what's on the left side. So it's kind of shorthand for an if statement. So a more real-world example would be if we wrote this code here that basically takes a button event, checks to see what the ID of the button event is, and based on the ID of the button event, it sets a background color. You can do that in 5 lines of code, or you can do it in 1 line of code using the ternary operator. So here we say, if this is true, if the user clicked on the background green button, go ahead and return green. Otherwise, return blue. So that's how that works. So let's go to truthy and falsy, because I just kind of used that, probably confused people who may not know what that is. Truthy and falsy. So I'm going to be as clear as I possibly can. Here are the possible falsy values. Null, not a number, 0, an empty string, and undefined. And also false itself is also falsy. So false and these values are falsy values. If it's none of those values, it is truthy, period. So in this case, I just have null, and you remember the ternary operator, null. So if this evaluates to some sort of truthy value, it's going to return what's on the left side of the colon. If it evaluates to some sort of falsy value, it will return this. In our case here, I'm going to go ahead and run this code. As you can see, all of those values are falsy. And null is falsy, not a number is falsy, 0, empty string, and undefined are all falsy values. So let me show you why that can be kind of useful. Let's say we have a string here, and we set it by default to an empty string. And then maybe some asynchronous code happens, and maybe some stuff happens in the background, and we want to check if string has some sort of meaningful value. So we say if string. In this case, it's not going to run because empty string is falsy. So it's not going to run this code at all. Then we go ahead and set it to hello. And now it has some meaningful value. It's not an empty string, so it's not falsy. It's actually truthy. So if string is actually true now. And we go ahead and log pass 2. And as you can see, we see pass 2, but we don't see pass 1. That's to kind of show how that works. Then the last 2 things, we're going to go ahead and do the spread operator. The spread operator there's a lot more to the spread operator than this. There's also the rest operator and also different things you can do with both of those operators. But I'm going to go over the basic here because we're going to be using the spread operator in this tutorial. So here we have an array, we call it fruit, and it contains apple, banana, and strawberry. All right, so fruit is the name of that variable. But here we want to create a new array called vegetables and fruit. And we want it to include all of the fruit, but also broccoli and carrot. Well, the easy way to do that is to use the spread operator. The spread operator is putting these 3 dots before the array. And what it does is literally spreads the items out. So it takes whatever's inside of here, spreads it out here, and then also includes whatever's after it or before it. So I could actually put something like this, and it would put all the fruit after this. But in this case, if we put this is what it would evaluate out to. This is a really convenient feature to JavaScript. And finally, short-circuiting. Short-circuiting, you've probably seen this when you've been reading code and you're like, what is this doing? This is what it does. So returns the left side if the left side is truthy. Otherwise, it will return the right side. So in this case, we're using the or symbol. As you can see here, we that this description is specifically for the or version of this. So since we know that 0 is falsy, then it's going to return the thing on the right side. However, if this were backwards, if I were to put like hamburger or 0, it would go ahead and return hamburger since it's not falsy. Now the and version of this is actually the complete opposite. This returns the left side if the left side is falsy. Otherwise, it returns the right side. So in this case, 0 is falsy. And since we're using the and version, it's actually going to go ahead and return 0. So go ahead and back out and go to this really quick. That is called short circuiting. All right, let's go ahead and run this. As you can see, the first one returns hamburger and the second one returns 0. So those are all the prerequisites that we needed in order to understand what's going on here. So let's go ahead and get started with the actual tutorial. All right, let's get started on this tutorial. So go ahead and create somewhere on your computer a folder called to-do list. And then inside of there, we're going to go ahead and put all of our files, including the background image. Now, this is the background image we're going to be using for this specific tutorial. I'm going to include this link in the description below. Please go here, download it, call it bg.jpg, or you can call it anything you want. Just make sure you reference it correctly in the CSS. Go ahead and put it in your to-do list folder. The next thing that you're going to want to do is let's actually go ahead and let's create our index.html file, our script.js file, and let's also create our style.css file. So now we have all three of these files, but we're only going to be worried about index.html for this moment. Go ahead and let's start creating the skeleton for it. So sorry about that. Let's go ahead and create HTML tags and then head tags. And then below the head tags, create body tags. And then at the bottom of the body tags, create a script tag with a source attribute equal to script.js. That's going to be our JavaScript file. And then up here, create a link tag, rel equals style sheet. And then let's go ahead and put the href equal to style.css, since that's what we called it. So now we have our CSS file and our JavaScript file imported. It looks like I put a typo somewhere, so let me figure out what's going on here. It's probably really simple. Okay, so it's because I only had one script tag and I did not close it. You don't need to do that with a link. Link tags you don't have to close. You can put this at the end of it if you'd like. But I'm going to go ahead and save it. And then now we have the style sheet and the JavaScript imported. They are empty, but at least we have them. So let's go ahead and get our Bootstrap put in. Bootstrap is just a CSS framework that makes it really easy to make certain HTML elements look good very, very, very easily. So go ahead and I'm going to include this link in the description. Go to this link, look for the CSS section, copy that, put it directly underneath our style sheet here. Then go to the JS section. That's our JavaScript for it. It requires a couple of JavaScript libraries. So go ahead and paste those directly underneath the link here and save. Now, we're not going to be writing any jQuery code or anything like that, but we do need it for Bootstrap. That's the only reason we're importing it here, okay? So let's get started writing our actual HTML. So we're going to start by creating a container. We're going to give it an ID of main, and this is actually going to be containing everything that all of our HTML. It's going to be the parent container. Inside of here, I'm actually going to create a header, and in here, I'm just going to say to do list app tutorial, and it's just a header to kind of explain what this page is. And then let's create a class called small bottom margin. We're going to define that in CSS later, and then the ID is header. All right, and I'm actually going to shrink this so that we're able to view this a little bit easier. So I can refresh it, and now save. Now we can see the header. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and create another div. This is going to be the container for the to-do list form, as we're going to call it, or it's really just the input in the button where we type our new to-dos and submit and add new to-dos. So let's give it an ID of new to-do form container, and then let's give it a class of small bottom margin. All right. So inside of here, we'll go ahead and put our input, and this is going to be of type equals text. And we're going to give a Bootstrap class to it called form control, which automatically makes it look a lot better than it would if we didn't have Bootstrap. And let's go ahead and give it an ID of new to do input. Okay, so let's see what we have so far. If we refresh this, we can see that we have a an input there. Let's go ahead and add the button. So let's add a class btn, put a space, and then btn primary. So those are two Bootstrap classes that are going to make our button look good. Let's put the text as submit, and let's actually give it an ID as well. Let's give it an ID. Let's call it submit new to do button. All right, so let's refresh. Cool, so now we actually have the submit button, the input, and a header, and the containers for all of this. Now, the last thing we're gonna add is an unordered list tag. Let's give it an ID of to-do list container. Let's give it a class of list group, which is a Bootstrap class. So we're not going to put anything inside of here, and if we save this and refresh, we won't see anything here because we don't have any list items inside of the unordered list container here. But we're going to be injecting list items via JavaScript. So our HTML file is actually done. And I think what we're going to do is we're probably going to do CSS last here. We're going to do CSS last. So let's go ahead and get all of the functionality out of the way. So let's start with a simple conceptual aside here. So there is a style of programming called declarative programming. And in declarative programming, what you want to do is essentially make it more obvious what's going on by declaring the intent of the program rather than writing out exactly how it works. I know that doesn't make much sense, but say you had a function that loops through some stuff. Instead of writing a for loop and writing some variables and then incrementing some number, wouldn't it be great if we had a .for each function for arrays? That would be a declarative thing. We actually do have that. So what we want to do, just to kind of prime your brain for some of the future tutorials that I'm going to be doing that are going to be more functional programming and more declarative JavaScript and that sort of thing, is kind of just introduce you guys to the concept of declarative programming through functions here. So the first thing I want to do is just create a storage key variable. And all that it's going to be is tutorial to-dos. And let me switch back. So now you can see this. So you can see I have a variable here called tutorial storage key set to tutorial to-dos. This is going to be our key for local storage. And if you don't know what local storage is, we're going to be using that in this tutorial. Basically, it's just the browser's way of letting you store stuff, kind of like a database. But don't think of it like a database because it's not really. It's just a key value storage system. Don't store passwords. Don't store credit card information or anything like that in there. It's not secure. It's great for this sort of thing. So we're going to use tutorial to-dos as our key, and we have it set to the storage key variable. Now, the first declarative style function that we're going to have is convert string to obj. And let's go ahead and start creating our arrow function. Now, the reason why we have to have a function that converts a string to an object is because in local storage, we can only store strings. We can't store objects in local storage. So what we're going to have to do is whenever we pull an item out of local storage, we're actually going to have to convert it from a string to an object. And whenever we store something in local storage, we're going to actually have to convert it from an object to a string. Okay? So in this case, we want to have functions that do both for us. So here we're going to want to convert string to object. JavaScript offers us a function that makes this very convenient called json.parse. JSON.parse takes a string, and then if it happens to be something that can be turned into a JavaScript object, then it does that and returns it for you. So json.parse. Now this function, this arrow function, is going to take an argument that we're going to call str, short for string, and we're going to pass it into this json.parse. Now let's say we don't have anything in our local storage. Let's say when we get this, we do json.parse string and local storage is empty. We haven't added anything yet. It's the first time using the app or something. Well, at this point, it would return undefined or null, and we don't want that. We want it to always return an array. Okay, so we're going to use short circuiting here to make sure that whatever we get from this function is going to be an array. We know that whatever we put into local storage is going to be an array of to-dos. So if this ends up being truthy, we know we're going to get an array of to-dos. We're going to short circuit otherwise. So if this is falsy, we're going to get an array, an empty array, instead of undefined or null. Now we're going to want to do the same thing with convert obj to string. Obj is going to be the argument here. And instead of JSON.parse, we're going to use JSON.stringify. And we're going to pass the object to it. Same concept. It takes a string, it takes an object and turns the object into a string. However, in this case, we always want a string from this function. So we're going to short circuit here. And if this happens to be some sort of undefined or null value, we're going to get an empty string from this function instead. So what's another thing that this to-do app has to do? What is another function we should declare the intent of? Well, one thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to be able to get to-dos. So let's create a function. Gosh, I cannot type. Const get to-dos. And let's set that equal to a function that goes to some functionality. Well, when we get the to-dos, we have to convert it from a string to an object. So let's go ahead and say convert string to object, because whatever it is we want from local storage, we're going to want to treat it like it's an object, because we're going to want to use the array. We're going to want to use all the functions that array has. We're going to want to loop through the array. We don't want it to be a string. So let's convert string to object. Now, how are we going to get the item that we want from local storage? Well, we know what the storage key is, and local storage has an API for us to use called local storage, and it has some functions, and we can do get item, and all that we have to do is give it the key that we're looking for, in our case storage key. So this right here, local storage.get item storage key, is going to go and get that string version of that array that we want, and that is automatically getting passed into our convert string to obj. So get to do is either going to return an empty array or the array of to-dos. So that's exactly what we want. We know for sure that whatever get to-dos is going to return will be an array. That's good news. What's another thing that our to-do app has to do? Well, we have to be able to add to-dos. So let's add a function called add to-do, which takes the to-do as the parameter or the argument. And let's think for a minute. We can only put strings into local storage. So let's go ahead and start setting up our local storage. Let's say set item, which is our function that we're going to use to set the item. The first argument to set item is the key. In our case is storage key. The second parameter, the second argument to local storage.setItem is the item you want to set. And remember, that has to be a string. So if it has to be a string, we're going to have to convert object to string, and we're going to want to pass the object, the array that we want to store as a string in local storage. Well, we already have get to-dos, right? We can just call get to-dos and get the entire list of to-dos that we have so far. But we also want to add the to-do that we're passing here to our add to-do function, right? So let's go ahead and put an empty array here. And let's take advantage of that spread operator we were talking about earlier. So let's say get to-dos. So now, so far, this array contains the list, spread, the array, of all the to-dos we already have stored. But we also want to add the to-do. And so using the spread operator, that's really easy. And now we have our add to-do function. But what else do we want to do with this app? We also want to delete to-dos. So let's add delete to-do. Let's give it an argument called to-do. And let's think about how we're going to delete a specific to-do from local storage. Well, if we think about it logically, delete to-do should be the exact same thing as add to-do, except instead of adding the to-do, it should just remove that to-do from the array. It should do the exact same thing add to-do does. So since that's the case, let's go ahead and say local storage.setItem go ahead and give it storage key as the first parameter. And now let's think for a minute. We know that it has to be a string, right? So let's go ahead and convert object to string. So go ahead and get that ready. Now what exactly is the object that we want to pass into this? Well, we want it to be the array of all the to-dos except for the one that we pass here. Think about that logically. If we delete an item from an array, effectively what we're doing is we're saying it's the same array minus the item that we want to delete. So let's go ahead and think of how to do that. Well, we can go ahead and get to-dos. And now we know get to-dos is an array. It's always going to be an array. Well, there is a specific function that's built into JavaScript for arrays called filter. And what it does is it returns a new array with all of the values that pass some sort of test. And in our case, filter is going to take, by the way, filter always takes a function. An arrow function is how we're going to give this, is how we're going to write this. So we're going to say to-dos is the argument for the function that we're passing into filter. And the test that we're going to want to do is we're going to say as long as to-do, sorry, let me call this to-do instead of to-dos. And I'm just putting the underscore here because I want to distinguish this from this to-do, okay? That's the only reason I'm putting the underscore here. And so if this little to-do here that we're on happens to not equal the to-do we pass to this function, we want to go ahead and let that into our final array. So this effectively says, as long as each to-do does not equal the to-do we pass to it, go ahead and let it in. However, if we do approach a to-do that does equal this to-do, we're gonna ignore that, and it's not gonna be let into our array. So effectively, we are deleting that item from the array. All right, so I hope that makes sense. Let's think, what's another thing that we're gonna have to do here? Well, thinking declaratively, we're gonna want a function that probably returns a new list item element, because we're going to want to inject new list item elements into our, let's look here, into our unordered list here, which is going to be all our to-dos. So we're going to have to create list items on the fly and then inject them in there. So wouldn't it be great if we just had a function that could create these list items for us? And then whenever we need a new list item, we just call this function instead of having to write this code like 100 times. Let's create a function called build to do element, build to do L, and it's going to take a to do, and what it's going to do is it's going to build an element and return it. So let's go ahead and say const L is equal to document.createElement. Now the type of element that we want, which we were talking about earlier, I want to be consistent with my quotes here, is a list item, so an LI. We want to create an LI. But we also are going to want to add a class to it. And the class that we're going to want to add is actually a Bootstrap class called list group item. And we're also going to want to take the inner text, the text inside of this list item, and set it equal to the to-do. And then we're going to want to return the element. So now we have a function that effectively builds this list item that we want and then returns it for us. And whenever we want that to happen, all we have to do is call this function instead of having to write these 4 lines, or essentially these 3 lines of code every single time. So what's another thing that we're going to want to be able to do? Well, we have the list item element now, but we need to actually inject that into the unordered list, right? So we need a function called append li, I guess, to DOM. We'll just DOM, document object model. We can call this function whatever we want, but this seems to make sense to me. We'll give it an li element, or let's just call it L so that we're consistent here. And let's say document.getElement by ID. Let's get that unordered list. What was the ID we gave this unordered list? We called it to-do list container. So let's reference that. Let's say getElement by ID, to-do list container. Now, what are we going to do now? Well, we want to append the list item. So let's say append child let's give it the element that we're passing here. So this function, append li to DOM, grabs the UL from the DOM and then appends the element that we passed to it into it. Okay, so now we have a pretty good tool set of functions so far, but we still need some more. What's another thing that we're going to have to do? Well, we're going to need to be able to clear the to-do list display. And the reason why we're going to have to be able to do that is because we're going to have to refresh our view. So whenever we add a new list item or whenever we delete a list item, we're going to want to make sure that we have the ability to refresh the view so we can instantly see that update. Okay. So how are we going to clear the to-do list display? Well, it doesn't really need a parameter. So let's go ahead and create our arrow function here and say document.getElement by ID. And the ID that we want here is actually to-do list container. And let's just set the inner HTML equal to an empty string. And that effectively removes all of the HTML that might, like all of the list items, they're gone now. So all we're left with is an empty unordered list. Okay, so what's another thing that we're going to want to do? We're going to want to clear the input. So this guy here, whenever we type in a to-do like this and we click submit, we're going to want to not only refresh this view, but we're also going to want to remove whatever's in here. So let's call this clear input. And it's essentially going to be the same thing as clear to-do list display, but we're going to do it a little different because we're going to say document.getElement by ID. The ID for the input, I believe, was new to-do input. And we're going to access the value attribute of that, and we're going to set that equal to an empty string. Okay, so that is fantastic. We have a pretty good tool set here. I think we're going to add probably 2 more tools here, and then we're going to start plugging our JavaScript up to the DOM. So when we type stuff and we click buttons, stuff actually happens. Because here all we have so far are functions that kind of make our life easier and in a more declarative way. Remember that. So let's create a function called display to-dos because we don't actually have a way to display the to-dos on the screen yet. So I'm going to add curly braces to this one because this is not going to be a single line function. First, we're going to want to clear the input. Then we're going to want to clear the to-do list display. Then we're going to want to, so as you can see here, you can see the benefit of using this declarative approach because now when you think about the function display to-dos, you can look at this function and be like, well, what does this function do? Well, it clears the input. It clears the to-do list display. It's very obvious what it's doing. And if you're curious what clear input does, for whatever reason, you want to see how it's doing it, you can just go to that function and see what it's doing. So this is so if new developers come onto a team or people are trying to read this code, it's so much easier for them to understand what's going on. And it's also easier for you to reason about as you're coding. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to, for each to-do that we have stored, we're going to want to build the element and then append it to the unordered list. So let's get the to-dos. So now we have the array of to-dos. And let us go ahead and say .for each. Now, get to-dos returns an array, so we can use for each, which is a built-in JavaScript array function. And we can say for each to-do, let's do some function. Well, in our case, what we want to do is we want to append li to DOM, but we have to actually have an li, right? So let's go ahead and say build to-do el and pass in our to-do because build to-do element, let's see, takes a to-do. So we give it the current to-do that we're on as we're iterating through the array, and we pass whatever that gives us to append li to DOM, and it goes ahead and does that for us. So again, it's very easy to understand what's happening here. And then finally, we're going to want to, at the end of this, we're going to want to do a function called init click listeners. Now, I'm going to go ahead and create this function. It's not going to do anything yet, but I want to create it so I can reference it up here because that's what we're going to want to do. And I'll explain what that does. So at the end of all of this, now that we have all of our to-dos inside of our unordered list on our HTML page, we want to go ahead and set up our event listeners. We want to be able to, when we click on one of those things, we want our JavaScript to start running. So if we have a function called init click listeners, it needs to do exactly that. It needs to initialize all of our click event listeners for all of our to-dos. So we wait until we have all of our to-dos in the DOM and on the index.html page, like actually there, injected into the document before we call this. So this is going to introduce a couple of concepts, okay? So first that we're gonna have to do is we're gonna use an array function. So array.from. An array.from attempts to create an array from some sort of array type object. In our case, we're going to use a query list. So we're going to say document.get elements by class name. And we're going to want to get all of the list group items. Now, we know for sure that list group item is being added as a class to all of our to-do elements because we're adding it right here. So what we're doing is we're saying document.get elements by class name, list group item. It's going to take all of the items, all of the elements that have that class and push them into a query list. And then we're going to say array.from so we can convert that query list to an array so that we can use our array functions on this query list. So now that we have an array of that, we can say for each, and now we can use for each. Now for each item, we want to do some stuff. So we want to say item.add event listener. The event listener we want is of type click. Whenever someone clicks on one of those, remember we're going to want to let them delete the list item. We want the users to be able to delete to-dos. And by deleting them, we just want them to be able to click on the to-do, okay? So the second argument to add event listener, so the first one is what type of event listener do we want? We want click. The second one is a function, and we're gonna do a arrow function here, and it's automatically going to pass the click event as the argument. So we're gonna put that there and begin our arrow function here. Now inside of our arrow function, we are going to use this event to figure out which to-do the user clicked on. So let's say const to-do is equal to event.target.enter text. So that event is our click event. We're choosing the element or the target of that event, whatever target they clicked on, and we're taking the inner text and we're calling that the to-do. Now, if you remember during the demo, when I clicked on one of the to-do items, it asked me, are you sure you want to delete this to-do? And that's good because you don't want to accidentally click on a to-do and it delete. You want to have a two-step sort of confirmation process to make sure that you actually wanted to delete that. So we're going to use the built-in window.confirm function, which just takes a string and it says OK or cancel. The OK button and the cancel button are built in automatically. If the user clicks OK, window.confirm returns true. If the user clicks cancel, window.confirm returns false. But you can pass in this string here so that you can at least decide what this window.confirm should say. In our case, we want to say, have you completed this task? And we want to make sure they know which task they clicked on. So let's go ahead and put to do here. And I'm sorry, that should be a plus. So we're concatenating the string. We're concatenating have you completed this task to the string to do. And so now they know that they clicked on a to do and which to do they clicked on. And if they do click OK, then whatever happens inside of this if statement will run. Well, if they do click OK, we want to delete to do, the current to do we're on. So in this case, to do, and we then want to go ahead and run display to dos because display to dos, if you remember, is basically what refreshes the entire view. So whenever we delete or add a new to-do, we want to make sure we call display to-dos afterwards. So now we have our init click listeners function. Now that we have all this and we refresh, you can see nothing really happens. We click on stuff, we can type stuff, nothing happens. So that's because we didn't set up our event listeners yet. And that's the very last part of our JavaScript section of this tutorial. What I'd like to do though, really quick, is at this point, just in case you guys have typos in your code or anything like that, let's create a quick button that will serve as a way to kind of delete your local storage so you can kind of restart from scratch, because you don't want to mess up your local storage and not have a way to be able to reset it. So let's go ahead and create a button here, and inside here we'll just say reset local storage, and let's give this button an ID of reset storage button, and then let's just give it a class of btn danger, just so it looks red, and kind of if we refresh it you can see it looks red, and it's more distinguished. So let's create a function that listens for clicks on reset local storage and resets our local storage. That should be the first thing we should do, because there is a chance that as you're following this tutorial you could mess up and accidentally mess up your local storage, and we really don't want that. So let's create, sorry, not a const. Let's say document.get element by ID, and we called that button, the ID, reset storage btn. Now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to add an event listener on that, and we're going to want to add it of type click. Now let's put our arrow function in here. Remember, it passes an event by default. We don't have to put this here because in JavaScript it will ignore the parameter if you don't put it here. So if it tries to pass an event object to a function that doesn't have that argument declared, it's not going to throw an error. But I just want to put this here so you guys remember that it does automatically send the event. So let's say local storage dot remove item storage key. Oops. There we go. So that will effectively delete our entire local storage for this specific key. And then afterwards, let's go ahead and display to-dos so that it'll refresh the screen. Now, again, in our case, we don't have any to-dos yet, so we can't really test this reset button yet. So let's change that. Let's actually start adding some stuff. All right, let's set a click event listener for the submit new to do button. So it's going to be essentially the same thing as this, right? So might as well copy this and paste it above here. But instead of the ID being reset storage button, it's actually going to be submit new to do btn. And instead of doing this stuff, we're going to do some different stuff. So we're going to say const new to do input. So we're going to reference this input right here. We want to get this input because we're going to want to get the text from it, right? So we're going to say document.get element by ID, and the ID for that input is, I believe, new to do input. Okay, now we have a reference to that input. So now we're going to want to go ahead and grab the text from that. So, but first we're going to say if new to do input dot value. So if it's not an empty string or null, because remember this will, remember truthy and falsy values from earlier. If this is an empty string or if this is null or something, we don't want to run whatever's inside of here. So first we'll check to make sure the value exists, and if it does, we'll go ahead and run add to do function, and we'll pass in new to do input dot value, so the text inside of it. But let's also add dot trim, and that will trim any white space from the beginning and end of it. So if I type space 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 hello space 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 and I click submit, trim will remove all of the white space here on the end and also all of the white space here on the beginning, but it will not remove any white space in between words like this. Okay, so we want to go ahead and add that. And then after we add to do, what's the thing that we want to do? We want to display the to-dos. Okay, well, now we should have the ability to add to-dos. Let's do one more thing. Let's actually display the to-dos when we click Like if I click refresh and I go to this app, I want the to-dos to go ahead and display for me. So let's go ahead and set an event listener on the document. But instead of click, obviously we don't want click, we want DOM, in all caps, capital C, DOM content loaded. Make sure that you get all the capitalization correct here. All right, so if, when that happens, go ahead and run this function. And in our case, it's just going to be display to-dos, okay? So whenever the DOM content is loaded, we're gonna display the to-dos. So I refresh. Let's refresh this page. First, let's check for any errors we might have. There's none in the console. Let's try to add a to-do. Let's say do tutorial, or actually in my case, finish tutorial. If I can spell, finish tutorial. Click submit, and what do you know? It worked. So what happens if I click it? It says, have you completed this task, finish tutorial? I'm gonna say no, click cancel, so it doesn't delete it. But let's try it again, click OK, and it does delete it. Now let's test the reset local storage button, make sure that works for you guys. Okay, so I have 3 to-dos. If I click reset local storage, it does in fact reset all of the local storage for us. So here I have a fully working app. So in my case, I'm gonna go ahead and take this reset button code. I'm gonna comment it out here in the script.js file, and I'm also gonna comment the button out here. And when I refresh, we don't have that to-do reset button anymore. Okay? Because in my case, it's already a working app, and I know I don't need it anymore, but you guys should keep that there until you're sure you have a fully working app. Let's go ahead and move on to the final part, the styles. Okay. Body. So here we're going to want to put padding 0 and margin 0. And we're going to want a background image. We're going to set that equal to URL, URL, and then, URL, and in parentheses here, we'll put a string, and we're going to call it bg.jpg, because if you remember, that's what we called it, and it's in the same folder here. So go ahead and save and refresh. You should see your background now. Now, we're going to do a couple of things to the background so that we can make sure that it's always sized properly, because if we look here, I can probably make this not work anymore. Well, normally you can, but we're gonna put this here just to be safe. So we're gonna add the WebKit, WebKit background size. We're gonna say cover. So I think I might have WebKit background size. Did I do that right? WebKit background size? Okay, so it's because I didn't add background size yet. Just normal background size. Background size, cover. There we go, now the green line went away. Let's do the same thing for Moz. Moz background size. In fact, I'm just gonna copy this and paste. Cover, and then finally, Opera. Background size, cover. Okay, so now when I save, you're not going to see much of a change here, but trust me, that's going to help you out. It's going to basically make sure that no matter what the size of the window is, the entire background of your window will be covered with the background image. Okay, now let's take our main div that we created. Let's create a static width of 520 pixels for it. And if you have a tiny screen or something, you can adjust this to whatever you want it to be, but just make sure that you adjust the other stuff as well. Margin left. So we're gonna use the calc function in CSS, and we're gonna say 50%. So we want the margin left to be 50% of the screen minus half of the width of the div. Well, half of 520 is what, 260? So let's say 50% minus 260. Now let's go ahead and set the background color so that we can at least see what's going on here. So if I set the background color, I'm gonna use RGBA because I want the background to be slightly opaque, and the A in RGBA is alpha. So we're going to say 255, 255, 255, which is white, and then 0.5, which means it'll be halfway invisible, essentially. So as you can see over here, the what the margin left is doing is making sure that the div is perfectly centered, and the width is 520 pixels. Cool. So let's do a margin top as well, because I don't like how it's sitting at the top of the screen. Let's say 100 pixels. Let's get it off the top of the screen, refresh. Oh yeah, that's way better. All right. What else do we want to do here? We want to add some padding to the inside here. I'm thinking 20 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Refresh. Oh yeah, that's way better. Let's add a box shadow. Whoa. Box shadow. And this is going to be 2 pixels, 2 pixels. I think, let's say 5 pixels black. Let's see what that gives us. It gives us this nice drop shadow, this depth effect. It kind of makes it look like it's closer to you than the background. Add a border radius of 5 pixels, which if I save that and refresh, it rounds the edges here so that they're not so pointy and sharp. And let's move on to the to-do list container. And inside here, we want to put overflow y equal to auto. Now, the reason why we want to do this is because basically, if we have like 50 to-dos, I want the screen, I want the main div here, this main block, to not move away. Like, I don't want to scroll down the screen itself. I want to scroll down the content that's inside of it. And I will actually just demonstrate that in just a second. Let me put like a silly height really quick of like 100 pixels. That might not be enough. That's perfect. So let's just start putting to-dos in here. So as you can see here, I can scroll through the to-dos rather than it being the entire page that's moving. But I think 500 pixels is more reasonable here. Yeah, that's way better. Cool. So let's go ahead and add our small bottom margin class. And remember, this is a class, so I'm using a dot instead of a pound sign. And let's do margin bottom, let's say 15 pixels. Now let's refresh this. Yeah, that's way better. But something that's kind of bothering me is the input and the button need to be on the same line, if you ask me. So let me go ahead and first do the header, because the header I kind of want to do text align center. Yeah, that's a little better. And then let's go ahead and do the input. So let's say new to do input. I think, oh, I put an @ symbol instead of a hashtag. All right, sweet. So new to do input, width 400 pixels, position relative, and I accidentally put widows. Let's try width, not widows. All right, so let's do display inline block and background color. Let's also do an RGBA here. I don't think it's gonna matter too much, but let's do 0.7. Now that's gonna fix it halfway. See, it leaves enough room here for submit, but the problem is submit, the button, its display is set to block, I believe. So that's fine. Let's just float it right. Let's just float it to the right. So let's say submit new to do btn. And in here, let's float it to the right. And let's make sure that the width is 75 pixels flat, because we want to make sure it does in fact fit there properly. So let's refresh. Oh, that looks way better. Cool. All right. So one thing that I want to make sure that we do is whenever we hover over these list items, it's not very obvious you can click them. So let's make it more obvious that we can click those things, that they're supposed to be clicked. So to-do list container, and then let's reference any LIs that might be inside of it. And let's say cursor pointer, and let's just set the background color. Background. Oh my gosh, color. This is I'm failing. To white. So when I refresh it, now we have a pointer, so it's more obvious you can click it, but let's make it look better. Let's make it look a little bit more dynamic here. So let's just take exactly the same reference here, but let's add : hover. And so whatever happens in between these curly braces will happen whenever you hover over these. In our case, I just want to change the background color to like, let's say gray. That way it's a little bit more dynamic. Sweet. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. A little harsh, but I think it's okay. So the final thing I want to do is the reset storage button. For you guys, this is only for you guys. I want to take the position and make it absolute. I'll show you why I'm doing this in a second. Let's put it in the top right, and let's give it a margin of 25 pixels. And the reason why I'm doing this, let's just add a few more to-dos here. Okay, cool. And increase the size here. So if I were to come in here and uncomment this button here and refresh before I added these last styles here, the button would be like down here and it would just be kind of out of the way. But now if we refresh, it's in this convenient position for you guys. And I'm gonna go ahead and comment that out one more time and show you guys that this is the final version of the app. We can delete to-dos, we can add new to-dos. This is a fully working to-do app. All right, that was a fun tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If this did help you, please subscribe to me and please like this video. If you want to support me, I did provide the Patreon link in the description, and I want to thank Martin one more time. And also, please follow me on social media so that I can, what I like to do is I like to say, hey, what's the next tutorial I should do, and have polls on Twitter and that sort of thing, and just kind of get and interact with you guys on Twitter. So that is all. Thank you guys.